This is Hanney Seylim in Critical Faculty. Today, I'm very, very pleased to introduce to you Aron Ra. Hello, Aron. How are you?
Sorry, it's Aron, please.
Aron. Okay. There's always that sort of confusion about spelling your name and your surname as well, because I wasn't quite sure if it had Egyptian background, the surname Ra.
Yeah, that wasn't my given name. What happened was when I first logged into Usenet like 20 some odd years ago, I needed to come up with a handle very quickly. And what I knew about Aron Ra was that it was a template for the God of Western monotheism. You know, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Baha'i. They're all seemingly based on Aron Ra. There were some interesting parallels to that predecessor religion. So I called myself Aron Ra, to just as an homage to that. I had no idea that I would end up being famous under that name. So now I'm kind of stuck with it.
This is really good. Aron, I don't want to really put words in your mouth, and I don't want to introduce you through Wikipedia, which is quite mundane. I just want you to introduce yourself to the Arabic audience who's going to be predominantly listening and be watching us today. And who are you? What you do?
I am a secular activist. I live in the United States. I live in Texas, specifically Dallas. And where I live is 50% creationists. I mean, half of the population believes in the Christian version of the biblical creation, where God builds a golem and breathes into it the breath of life and magically poofs things into existence, all of that sort of thing. And these religious extremists own and control every level of our state and federal government, from the highest offices all the way down to the school boards and city councils and so forth. So you can imagine this explains a lot of our problems. In fact, Trump, our president, just today announced that the next Supreme Court justice is going to be another young earth creationist who does not believe in the separation of church and state. So he wants a Supreme Court justice who wants to turn the United States into a theocracy like Saudi Arabia.
That's incredible. We watch this here from around the world. We're looking at the US as a super country and have led sort of the civilized world of the Second World War, and to see it plummet into that sort of medieval sort of mentality is quite saddening, to be honest.
Well, this was a comparatively great country once.
Yeah, I still maintain the U.S. Constitution is among the best in the world.
Yeah, it's too bad that our president doesn't believe in it, because our president wants to. What does the Constitution say? First Amendment says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Yet Trump wants to establish Christianity as the state religion and teach creationism in schools. Then the second clause is that Congress shall not write a law that it prohibits the free exercise of religion. And Trump wants to ban all Muslims. And of course, if you establish a state religion, that already puts everybody else, every other religious perspective, into a class of second-class citizens. Then, as far as or the freedom, we shall not abridge the freedom of speech. But Trump wants to be able to sue and lock down whole companies that criticize him. That's why there's no TikTok in the United States, right? He just shuts down anybody that has a platform against him. He shuts it down. And then the freedom of the press was also established by our First Amendment, and so Trump wants to sue news agencies that report not favorably about him. And he also randomly, his forces arrest journalists, and there's no consideration for journalists like there used to be. Like, the press pass used to mean something, and it doesn't anymore. So Trump has gone completely against every single provision of the First Amendment, and that's just the First Amendment. He's gone against a lot of the rest of our Constitution too. He's an extremely dangerous incompetent.
Yeah, I think I've heard as well a couple of days ago that apparently he's threatening not to hand over his presidency in peace if should he sort of loses the next election, which is quite strange.
Yeah, well, fortunately, Congress rallied together to say that there will be a peaceful transition of power. So the entire Senate, this is unanimous, and that is rare. Our Senate rarely votes unanimously on anything, but they voted unanimously yesterday that if he loses, there will be a peaceful transition. In other words, once he's no longer president, that's it. Then he becomes a squatter in somebody else's property, and the forces can go in and drag his ass out. And then as soon as they do, he will be indicted on a whole lot of charges that he is currently protected from by his office. And that's the reason he wants to hold on to power. He knows he's going to prison. His taxes will be revealed to investigators and prosecutors as soon as he is out of the office. And he already knows what's going to happen when they get a hold of his taxes.
Yeah. Actually, there is a quite relevant question on the screen right now. And I've actually often asked that myself. Somebody's asking here live, do you think Trump is actually religious, or he's just a salesman who knows what to sell?
Trump is just a salesman. I don't want to claim him as an atheist. I don't think he is an atheist. I think he thinks that there's a God, but that whether there's a God or not is irrelevant. And everybody's God, everybody's personal God already understands all your own bullshit excuses. I mean, the God that lives in your head fully understands why you did whatever you did. And of course, your God, your personal God, accepts every excuse you make up. Because why would he? I mean,
absolutely, yeah. It's concerning with politics. I mean, and we're going to get to the point of religion and science very soon, but it's very concerning when you have politics and religion work hand in hand, and the ultimate victim is going to be the citizens of this once great country, I think. Now, our conversation is going to concentrate and focus around evolution and science today. And for our audience sake, I just want you to very simply introduce what is evolution.
Evolution is the biological process of inherent genetic modification. It's descent with inherent genetic modification. In other words, when you start with one species and you derive from that many different varieties, like look at all the different types of cattle that breeders have wrought, right? I mean, all the different breeds of cattle. Well, what was discovered is using the same process. You know, the genome builds up a certain number of differences in all of these different breeds, but if you isolate them so that they go for a while where they can't interbreed with each other, they continue to build up their individual mutations. I mean, every human, for example, is born with an average of 128 mutations per zygote. That's just what you start with from the moment of conception. And these tiny little differences build up so that eventually you have a lower and lower probability should one of these stray breeds that wandered off into some other field by themselves for generations, if some lone wanderer comes in with the other population again, you have a lower and lower probability of them being able to produce a hybrid that is viable or that is fertile or that can exist at all. So this is where you get new species according to the species concept, at least applicable to sexually reproductive animals. There are different rules for plants because they follow different rules, and there are different rules for microbes. But for sexually reproductive animals, that's what a species is.
Right. So I guess Charles Darwin on the Beagle, I think, visited one of those 13 or 14 islands, and this is when he realized the finches that were eventually one, when they start separating and living in isolated islands with different food sources, their beaks started to change. And I think this is when the penny dropped at that point. Would that be right?
Yeah. So another way to put it is if you take, I like to use the analogy of language, because a lot of people, the thing that people don't understand about evolution is that it is a population level change. So an analogy that I like to use to keep people in line with that is that the language of Latin that was used in Rome 2,000 years ago became Italian, which is a different language, where Italian replaced Latin. Now, Latin also spread out into Europe and became Spanish, French, and Romanian, and then eventually Portuguese as well. Now, the way that it changed into other languages is called cladogenesis. The original language remains the same. But when you send people to France or to Spain, as generations continue, little variations in the language crop up, little slang terms and contractions and that sort of thing, until Spanish. There's a point where you look at some documents from several hundred years ago, you'll realize that the thing that you're reading that was written in Spain 1,000 years ago or whatever is not quite Latin anymore. It's not the original Latin anyway. It's still a Latin language, but it's not the Latin that was spoke in Rome. But neither is it Spanish that is spoken in Madrid now. So that's a transition. And biology is much the same way. A lot of creationists will misrepresent evolution, talking about the first man, right? Or the first dog or whatever. So you have a dog and suddenly it's like as if a lump of hamburger suddenly turned into a dog. And then the dog has to go look for a female dog because everything's got to be male first, of course, in a creationist mind. But the thing is when you look at the analogy of language, and this is how population level changes work, there would never be a first guy to speak French or a first guy to speak Italian wandering around a bunch of Latin speaking people. 1,000 years ago, you would have people that were speaking not quite Roman Latin and not quite Italian. It's somewhere in between, and everybody still understands each other. You can tell that the dialect is representative of the time that they live in. And this is the kind of change that we see all the time anyway. If you take a group of people, if you wiped out everyone on the planet and just saved one little population, one city, for example, everybody's all kind of homogenous, and then different people go out to repopulate the planet. So you have one group of people and they move into Nigeria, and another group of people moves into Iceland or whatever. And after several generations, you're going to be able to tell just by looking at these people, the descendants of those people, where they came from. If you meet them in an airport in some middle point, you would be able to look at them and realize by their features, that one's the one that came from Africa, that's the one that came from Iceland, because the environment changes people over time. And that's just the environment. That's not even talking about mutations yet.
Yeah. No, I quite like the analogy actually with language, because one of your conversations with Kent Hovind, he kept saying evidences, and you kept telling him it's an uncountable noun and you don't count it. But unfortunately, this sort of language is creeping into our dictionaries at the moment. So because they've given up on people making the same mistake, like the past tense of forecast, and people say forecasted now, and they just couldn't deal with it, even dive, and now it should be dived in. And some dictionaries go.
I like the dictionary now gives the definition of literally as not literally, because people so often misuse the word.
Yeah, and it's really funny because you're right. There isn't a nation that spoke ancient Greek and then suddenly within one generation they spoke the modern Greek. It sort of phased in and transitioned smoothly. It's seamless. You don't even see it, and that's exactly the same argument of they probably say, that in the Arabic world they go, well, I've been going to Zeus for the last 35 years and I've never seen a monkey turn into a man. So it's not going to happen.
Well, the people who say this are making an actual conscious effort not to understand what they don't want to believe. Granted, evolution is a complicated thing. It's really hard to simplify it so that people can understand it. And when you do understand it, you don't understand it quite correctly. You have to work with analogies, as we've just been doing, because it is very complex. It's hard to depict. We know that it's not an evolutionary ladder like Aristotle depicted it to be, nor is it actually a tree like Darwin predicted it to be, because there are so many times when divergent branches can still intermingle again. So it's something you don't see in trees where two branches grow into each other and then out again. That doesn't happen, but in biology it can. In phylogeny it can. So it is a complicated thing. It's a difficult thing to understand correctly, but we're talking about people who don't want to understand it at all.
Oh, I agree. I mean, evolution, after all, doesn't really deny that there is a God, but it denies at least that Abrahamic God, because that creation story won't fit. Wouldn't that be sort of right assumption?
Yeah, I would have to say that like Francis Collins was the director of the Human Genome Project, and he is an evangelical Christian. So he's about as Christian as they come, but he's a geneticist. He has advanced degrees in science, and he has expertise in genetics, and so he understands better than anyone that Adam and Eve contradict the evidence. As Christian as he is, he says that there can't be an Adam and Eve because the genetics simply don't allow it. That we did have a time some 75,000 years ago when the human population was reduced to only 10,000 people or thereabouts. But there was never and could never have been a time when there were only 2 people. And the excuse that creationists use is to say that well, Adam and Eve had perfect genetics. No, that doesn't work either. And it's only people who don't understand genetics at all who even say that. But well, people who understand genetics can say that if they're just really determined to believe. Answers in Genesis, which is located in Kentucky here in the United States, is a huge $20 million a year ministry that does pseudoscience. And what they do is they hire people who have actual scientific degrees, but who don't care what the truth is. They hire people like Andrew Snelling, for example. He's a geologist. He was working in Australia, and he himself personally dated the Kungura Formation in the billions of years old, and he wrote a brilliant paper giving all of the different types of dating methods he used to come up with this date of 2 billion years for this rock formation. But at the same time that he was doing legitimate science, he was also writing pseudoscience for the organization that would become Answers in Genesis when he said that all fossils were formed by the flood. Now, here's a man who, in his own mind, knows exactly why this other personality of his is lying. I have personally interviewed a handful of scientists who became believers, who were atheists and then became believers. And the weird thing is, none of them believe for scientific reasons. Well, actually, there was only one who was an actual scientist who came to that position. But his admission was that he believes simply because he wants to. And that's it. It's an entirely emotional desire. It's like whether you like celebrating Christmas or some other holiday. Is there something about your childhood that caused that holiday to be endearing to you? You like the pomp, the circumstance, the decorations, the costumes, whatever. And so you glom onto that. And so that's what this person did.
Yeah. I mean, the story with Francis Collins, I mean, it's a testimony to the partition in the brain, like the likes of Isaac Newton, who were brilliant, done in 18 months or close to 2 years, what people perceive to be the work of probably a century of multiple scientists, and yet believed in weird stuff. But Francis Collins' conversion story is quite a remarkable one, where he looked up, I think, a stream of water that was frozen in 3 parts and knelt and accepted Jesus as his savior. That is non sequitur.
Exactly. And everybody has said that. How did Francis Collins use that as an example of why he would become Christian? That makes no damn sense. But it's an emotional attachment. And we've noted also that religion appeals to the same areas of the brain as do narcotics. So people who are likely to become, particular fans of a given drug are also just as susceptible to religion for the same reasons. And so, that's my situation, is that I'm not interested in religion for the same reason that I'm not interested in narcotics.
Yeah, it's incredible, really. So, I mean, let's start from the beginning. I mean, we had a very simple and straightforward explanation of evolution, kind of how Darwin sort of stumbled on the idea to start with, and he didn't stop at that. That was the first sort of assumptions, but he started collecting and looking at fetuses in wombs and realizing that there are similarities. I think the slits or the openings around the neck, so that becomes sort of our inner ears in the humans, but then the gills in fish, and then holy cow, we're related to fish, and this is when we realize we could be all connected. And he was so afraid that he didn't publish any of his work for some years. Why is that?
Look at the environment that he lived in. I mean, you mentioned Newton earlier for believing in alchemy. Right? Give Newton credit that he lived in an environment where a lot of people believed in alchemy. Now, had Newton been raised, or even by the time he was 20 years old, if he'd been, been passed forward in time to the modern day and had to re-begin, his education. Let's say Newton at 18 goes into college in the 20th century, or better, 21st century. He would have changed so many of his beliefs so quickly, that we can't really fault Newton for believing weird things because he came from an environment of people that believed weird things. Likewise, we could say that Darwin was guilty of all of the same types of prejudices that the ethnocentric Britons of his day were. Remarkably, though, he wasn't guilty of quite everything that you would expect of somebody that was raised in British aristocracy at the height of the British Empire. When they were the greatest race in the world and the sun never sets in the British Empire and all of that. And yet, Darwin had been around the world himself personally and found himself again and again advocating for people that had been subjugated. He was advocating for the darker races against his own over and over again. Have you ever read Origin of the Voyage of the Beagle?
Yes.
Yeah, it's brilliant work. I mean, Darwin hadn't yet realized evolution. He was still a Christian at that time. But you can see the thinking of the man was active and fair and engaged. And it's beautiful, his observations that he had before he ever happened across that theory. You can see why the theory occurred in his mind and not in the mind of his captain. Yeah.
And it's always been sort of an argument spouted by religious people. You watch Dinesh D'Souza, for example, debating, and always have the hundreds of names of scientists who were Christians, and always the likes of Hitchens and everybody who would debate him say, well, if I was born 5 centuries ago, I probably would have been a religious person. So what,
Yeah. And I don't know what my situation would be. I mean, I believed an awful lot of ridiculous things when I was a kid. So I was very much a product of my culture and my location. I mean, we lived in Southern California in the late 60s and early 70s. So I was raised with all kinds of woo. So we're very much a product of our culture, and it's hard to disassociate from that. And it's hard to eliminate all of the impacts and influences that has on our thinking.
Yeah, I completely agree. So let's just address some of the misinformation about the theory of evolution. And one of them is, it's only a theory. If it's
that's my favorite one. It's the one I most like to dispute or rebuke. See, science has a rule that no hypothesis can ever be proven. They can be disproved, but they can never be proved in the positive sense, because that would close our minds to the possibility of further improvement. And the goal of science is to improve understanding. So when a given hypothesis is given, it is shown to have profound explanative power, and it has already sustained a substantial battery of critical analysis where new evidence and experiments always only ever lend additional support to the theory, and there's no discovery that ever contradicts it, then that theory has been effectively proven by an overwhelming preponderance of evidence beyond reasonable doubt. But we still don't call it proven. Instead, we elevate that hypothesis to the level of theory, which is the highest level of confidence that science can achieve, because there's a rule that you can never prove a theory.
Correct. I mean, proof only exists in mathematics anyway. Otherwise, in science, it's evidence and it's provisional, because it is so humble that it always gives space to be improved and enhanced over time. That's one of the strength of science, if you wish. So I mean, okay, so it's obviously this is the highest discipline in science when something elevates itself to be a theory. That means it's backed up by huge amount of evidence, not evidences. and also multiple disciplines and science have come to support the theory of evolution. For example, Darwin did not know about genetics.
Yes. Yeah, he came up with this weird idea about gemmules. That, I mean, he was trying to come up with anything to explain what he thought were heritable units of information, and that part was right. I mean, that there are heritable units of information from the mother and father, but what they were, he couldn't possibly know. And curiously, it was just a few years later that Gregor Mendel, who was a monk, was doing all of these experiments with pea plants, and he discovered genetics. And so he had actually answered Darwin's dilemma, but somehow they never connected, even though they were effectively contemporaries. And then Mendel's work was like forgotten until somebody else discovered the same thing. And then this is another frustrating thing. The guy discovers genetics, and he wants to announce that he's discovered this greatest thing that's going to make his life and put his name solidly in the history books. And then somebody else realizes that, no, that's the same thing that this other guy, Gregor Mendel, wrote about. So he actually discovered genetics and not you.
Yeah.
And the is we wouldn't have known about Gregor Mendel had this other guy, whose name is now lost, this other guy not discovered genetics and then calls light to that previous discovery. So that's how merciless science can be.
Yeah, and similar situation. I mean, Wallace came up almost with the same sort of idea as Darwin, and they start communicating, and it could have been the other one, but Wallace disappeared because he was a little bit of a wacko as well.
Oh, Wallace was a hell of a wacko, and when Wallace even gave up science altogether for mysticism later in life. And the sad thing was that Wallace's initial discoveries as a young man were brilliant, and it's as if he completely lost his mind later on. So imagine had Wallace not written to Darwin directly to talk about this and reveal to the very man who had already done 10 years of research on this subject, where Wallace hadn't done any research. Wallace literally he got a fever and he had a fever dream that told him what evolution is. I mean, can you imagine that going into the history books? This would have been like a supernatural revelation. Yeah. Whereas Darwin's observation was based on extensive data that he had researched and tested and everything over and over again, over a decade of obsessive study while keeping his theory a secret. And the only reason that Darwin ever published was because Wallace wrote to him, and Darwin realized he had run out of time. So yeah, I'm fascinated by the history of early science, and not just with evolution, but with a lot of science in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. It's fascinating to me to see where these minds came from the mindset that they had, from the culture that they had, and how that actually impeded a lot of advanced thought.
Like your analogy, Aron, the precursor, it can exist in biology, but also can exist in culture. So if alchemy was the precursor of chemistry, and all these sort of ancient, kind of sciences have been the precursors for the modern sciences. In biology, you can have precursors for a wing or for an eye, so it's always starts with humble beginnings and evolves from there.
Yeah, there's one scientist that I like who doesn't get mentioned much. Hanney Seylim was the one who came up with the idea that dinosaurs were either bird-hipped or lizard-hipped, and that's the one claim to fame that he has, and even that now is being overturned by more recent data, so that his old division that we've been using for over 100 years is not even actually valid. the funny thing is you read a bunch of his work, and when he started out, it's much the same as what we were talking about. He was a product of his time. He had a certain amount of ignorance bred into him and wacky ideas. Like he suggested, for example, that birds had evolved not from dinosaurs, but from sea turtles, because sea turtles flew through the water with these big paddle-like flippers, and that the sea turtles had beaks. Now, this was his early part of his career, which that idea is just absolutely wackaloon. And the interesting thing about him is, and I love to see this because I've seen this in a number of scientists, including Darwin himself, where you read their early work, and it's vastly different than their later work because they're discovering as they go. And the human mind is malleable, and you learn things you realize you were wrong before. And so Hanney Seylim went through a number of periods where he was advocating for something in his youth that he's now completely against as a senior person. It's like, no, that was absolutely wrong. I have since figured out it's more likely this. And so allies that they had when they were young become enemies in their old age. It's a beautiful thing for me personally to read the original work of these scientists in the 1800s and 1900s, early 1900s, to see how their minds had changed over time and for what reasons.
And I guess that's what Dawkins coined the word meme, which is the equivalent of gene, but in terms of thoughts and ideas, and almost act almost the same way, in such an interesting way. Obviously, with the creationism movement that you've been sort of battling for decades now, you get two types. You get the old Earth, and you get the young Earth. The young Earth have used the chronology in the Bible to come up with a figure of about 5,000 to 6,000 years, which is quite interesting. How do you see the two different movements of the creationism, the old Earth and the young Earth?
Well, creationism is, again, it's make-believe. It is literally make-believe. It's make people believe. They don't care what the truth is. They would rather believe something else. And when they say believe, it's not the same as if I say I believe something, it means that I think this is true, or I think it's most likely true, or I think that this is closest to the truth, but I can't actually prove it. That's what believe means to me. But to believers, belief is a verb. It's something that you do as an act of will, of mind over matter. It's where you convince yourselves of things that are not actually true. So believers are convincing themselves, because they always say that, that whatever that they're trying to achieve can only be achieved if they believe hard enough. Believe hard enough? It's an admission that you're convincing yourself. You are lying to yourself. So creationists glommed on I forget his name for the moment. The guy, Bishop Ussher, who did the math of counting up all the begats to come up with how the Earth was created on a Sunday at 9 o'clock in the morning by whatever time zone nobody knows, because Bishop Ussher didn't give any thought to that. Well, maybe it wasn't him that came up with 9 a.m. I think it was actually some other guy that came up with 9 a.m. But equally ridiculous. So Bishop Ussher comes up with the date in 4004 BC, and he comes down to it to the day. Now, how do you count up all the years and come up with the day?
Yeah,
because I told you what month or day and what year such and such person was formed, but it doesn't matter. The details. The devil is in the details, so the believers say. So they don't look at details.
Yeah. And how can you come up with a morning concept if the sun wasn't created by that point? Because it was just the Earth first, and then the sun and the moon were created thereafter. So there wasn't morning, right?
So one of the many details that they don't look at is that by Bishop Ussher's math, the height of pharaonic Egypt was in the middle of the flood. Because it was like 2,300 years ago, according to Bishop Ussher. And we know that can't be. We know that all of these events that Bishop Ussher talked about are all definitely, absolutely, provably wrong. So why do we make exception for the creation of the Earth when we know that everything else extrapolated from that is wrong too?
Yeah.
That, and I've just taken a number of courses in anthropology, primatology, cultural anthropology, and physical anthropology, and the amount of data and the kind of data and the depth of the data that we have it's impossible for me to express at this time how much we know and how solidly we know that belief is absolutely false. But creationists don't care at all what the truth is. There's a guy named Kurt Wise who got an actual legitimate college degree from Harvard from Stephen Jay Gould. So he's being taught in the best schools by the best guy. And yet he realized that the religious belief that was taught to him in his childhood would be completely false, absolutely false, if he believed in the reality that he now understands.
Yeah.
So he gave up his entire Harvard education
to
become a young earth creationist and lied to himself for the rest of his life.
Yeah. I mean, talking about Stephen Jay Gould, what do you think of the phrase, the non-overlapping magisteria? I mean, what do you reckon?
I have read that, of course, a few times, but I can't remember off the top of my head what that is.
He's basically decided that the discipline of religion and science they're overlapping. They can coexist, basically, but they should be separate. Yeah.
We've seen that demonstrated in a whole bunch of scientists. I've written so much about this. I can't believe that I couldn't remember when you mentioned it what the overlapping magisteria is. In the 1960s, I think it was 1966, Theodosius Dobzhansky did the first laboratory experiment proving speciation, the emergence of a new species under directly controlled laboratory conditions. And he wrote this famous paper. The title of the paper was that evolution, how did he phrase it? Evolution is the only, I can't believe it. I can't remember what the title is. I'm having a senior moment here. The only thing that makes sense, or that biology only makes sense in light of evolution. Something like that. That was the name of his paper, or it was a close approximation of that. And he was a Russian Orthodox Christian. And he's the one who's proving that origin of species by natural selection, exactly what Darwin's title was about, actually happened in a laboratory experiment. And it was just the first one. It's happened many times since then. Francis Collins is another evangelical Christian we just talked about, right? Who is one of the champions of evolution. And Dr. Kenneth Miller, who was the star witness in Kitzmiller versus Dover. Mm-hmm. He is a traditional Catholic. And he says that by the broadest definition, he believes in a creation, but he's not a creationist, because creationism, by definition, objects to evolution, at least to macroevolution, without understanding what macroevolution even is. So some of the greatest champions we've had of evolution have been Christians, and even traditional Christians, who hold to that belief for whatever compartmentalized reasons have absolutely nothing to do with science, as we've discussed. Yeah.
Well, that micro and macro evolution, and my understanding of, please correct me if I'm wrong, because it's always often been used in people who are trying to masquerade behind science. They go like, I actually believe that there is a bit of evolution going on, but it happens at the micro level, but not the macro level. So my understanding, they're both in the same, just given time. Time is the ingredient.
Yeah, the people who say that don't know what macroevolution really is, and they don't know what microevolution really is either. They don't understand either one. If they actually understood microevolution, if they understood that adequately, macroevolution is an automatic extrapolation. There's no way you could understand microevolution by itself and not realize that macroevolution is also an inevitable result. If you can walk a block, you can walk a mile. You can walk 10 miles.
Exactly. Yeah, it's just a logical inference. You don't really need to. It's just given the time ingredients will take care of that. Speciation.
I need to specify, though, that one important thing. There, Ken Ham of Answers in Genesis and Kent Hovind of Creation Science Evangelism, two of the most quoted names of the whole creationism movement, both of them accept that speciation happens. But neither one accepts that macroevolution, MA as opposed to MI, the big scale evolution, neither of them admit that happens, even though by definition, speciation is the origin of species. That's macroevolution. And they admit the speciation happens, but they don't admit what it is.
Yeah. Well, speciation is when a species sort of get isolated from another, and by the virtue of being completely distant in terms of land, food resources, they eventually comes a point where they can no longer breed with the cousin species, and they become in their own right a separate species. Would that be sort of an okay analogy?
Again, that's true only for sexually reproductive animals, because there are different rules for sexually reproductive plants and for asexually reproductive microbes. There are ways of identifying what those species are, and it's like, by a suite of different criteria. So there are different rules, but essentially, yes. Yeah,
that's right. So we mentioned Ken Ham. Correct me if I'm wrong. This is the guy with the art museum.
Yes.
Oh God.
The guy who got free donations of $100 million to build a fake boat on land that he now owns as a gift. He runs an evangelical ministry, the Creation Museum, that brings in an estimated $20 million a year, and he doesn't have to do anything for that. He calls himself doctor, because a lot of creationists call themselves doctor when they don't deserve it, because he was given an honorary title by some religious university. So he doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about, nor does he have to. All he has to do is share his prejudice in a way that appeals to other people who don't know any better.
Yeah. And scientifically, how can we falsify the Noah's Ark story?
I did an 8-part video series. If you'd like to include the link to that in the description below. Yeah, and that was a lot of fun, because every level of science or every discipline of science that's relevant to this at all, whether it's geology or botany or zoology or what have you, all disprove Noah's flood. We absolutely know. We know for absolutely certain that the global flood never happened. Yeah. We know what did happen, and it was a completely different story, even attributed to a different pantheon of gods posthumously, because the original story didn't have anything to do with any gods.
Yeah, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Yeah.
It goes earlier than that. Yeah. The story, archaeologists have traced the story down to a guy named Ziusudra, who was punting a barge. He had a round floating bowl, basically, with livestock on it that he was taking to market. And there was a flood of I think it was the Euphrates, and it washed his ass into the Red Sea, where his punting stick no longer works because he's in the Red Sea now. And so he had to wait until his bowl of livestock came to shore, in which time, of course, because he's a religious nut job like all of them were back at that time, he ends up sacrificing his animals, and then we just have this huge exaggeration story about it, that it was another 1,000 years before the Epic of Gilgamesh did the revamp of that story, and another 1,000 years after that before the version of Noah.
Yeah. It's incredible. It keeps recycling, and it's basically starts from the same story. Now, the creationism movement is I think it's quite relatively easy to sort of to counter. However, just in the beginning of the 80s, there came, obviously after creationism could not be taught in the US, and they wanted to masquerade the movement in a scientific way, and here comes the intelligent design movement that is trying to sound like science, so it can't smuggle its ideas into a competing theory
Yeah, often described as creationism in a lab coat.
Yeah, that's a funny one. Yeah, so I mean, we obviously know Michael Behe and all these people who started, but they've had apparently about 6 or 7 low cases, all of which have been lost and been dismissed by the U.S. Supreme Courts. You want to give us a background?
It was a district court, but there was no reason to take it to the Supreme Court. The intelligent design advocates already bailed when it went to district court. They realized already that they were going to lose. Michael Behe was the only one that would still go, and he testified, and he became a huge embarrassment, not just to them, but his own son. Michael Behe's eldest son is an atheist who, in his youth, was forced to live in Behe's basement because of Behe's shame that his own son was an atheist.
Wow.
Yeah, and remember, Behe has no scientific justification. Everything that Behe argued for that was supposed to be inexplicable by science had already been disproved by Kenneth Miller before they ever even went to trial.
Yeah. I mean,
but there's some things that you read about recurring in court, but there's other arguments that Behe didn't bring up because Behe already knew that Kenneth Miller had already disproved them completely.
Yeah.
So
I've listened to his debates about, obviously it's all around the irreducible complexity and the bacterial flagellum and the motor within it. But he's somehow, the mousetrap analogy, and he's telling you about all these parts of the mousetraps is like, as if they were just there. And I wanted to say, well, each of these parts have evolved on their own from also primitive beginnings, and then natural selection find a reason for them to be used. But just the way he's done this, it's almost like he's completely changing the analogy to suit what he wants to fit in terms of criteria. But I've always found his analogy to be completely flawed. But what do you think about the irreducible complexity? Bogus?
I'm sorry, what? The critical...
Do you think that is a bogus? Yeah.
The intelligent design thing, they never even established that there was a possibility. And they're already arguing for the probability. And they're doing this by the God of the gaps argument, that anything that science cannot explain can only be explained by God, not understanding that gods and magic are not an explanation. You have to show that there is gods and magic before it can qualify as an explanation.
Yeah. Well, the intelligent design are trying to say, oh, we actually don't invoke the word God at all in all of our papers. But it's really funny when you Google intelligent design, the subtitle in Wikipedia as pseudoscience. I mean, what else do you need?
Well, yeah, they actually do. They say that they don't, but they do. Yeah, I can't remember what the name of the guy was, but one of the strong guys in intelligent design around 2005 admitted in a public document that, yeah, we're talking about God. What the hell else could it be?
That's Dembski, I think.
It might have been Dembski. I can't remember clearly.
Yeah.
Whether it was Dembski or not. I want to say that it was somebody else.
Yeah.
Dembski is not, even by the creationist standards, even by the intelligent design standards, and Dembski is not that bright. I mean, I saw him at Prestonwood Baptist Church here in Dallas. He was debating Christopher Hitchens, and I was in the audience for that, and I was bewildered. I'm like, okay, so the creationists, you've hired Christopher goddamn Hitchens. He's our best, and the guy that you've chosen, your champion, Dembski. Really? Aren't there at least like a half a dozen guys you could have picked that would have been better than Dembski?
Yeah.
And not that there would be anybody that could have beat Hitchens, but to choose Dembski was a lack of forethought.
Yeah, yeah.
And
you know,
he didn't even do any research. If I were in Dembski's shoes and I knew that I was going to be debating somebody like Hitchens, I would have watched everything that Hitchens ever argued. I would have read everything that he'd written. But unfortunately, no. Dembski read one of Hitchens's books and tried, sadly, pathetically, tried to refute Hitchens' book, God is Not Great. So he missed the topic of the debate and failed. It was almost beautiful how pathetic it was.
He's actually a mathematician and like computer scientist, and he's trying to push the intelligent design from statistical and probabilities point of view. He's actually
they all do.
Yeah, also it's like possible.
They don't realize that there's a fallacy of probability. The fallacy of probability is, what are the chances of X? But they don't realize that what are the chances of everything you did today? If you predicted any of those things yesterday, there would be an enormous improbability, several decimals long.
Yeah, it's exactly like the fine-tuning argument. It's the other way around. It's like, well, we're here now, so it's happened. It was, we're here.
Yeah. What are the chances that today happened? 1.
Yeah, I think Neil deGrasse Tyson had a very, very good example of flipping coins. Of if you bring 1,000 people to flip coins and heads and tails, and you sit down everybody who's got only tail, and eventually you're going to end up with that one person who gets it right. And when you do the calculation and the probability, that's almost near impossible. But it would inevitably have to happen eventually.
Yeah, and that's what the failure of that argument is. And when they're arguing about what chances there are of it happening, they're showing that they don't understand what the processes are that made it happen in the first place.
Yeah. And I think that's the failure of any scientific endeavor when you start already with, I've got the answer. I think I've got the answer, and I'm going to try to fit all the scenarios to fit that final decision that I've already made. But science is exactly the opposite. We don't know until let the steps lead you to the decisions you need to make, and they all get that pathetically wrong.
And the reason why science works exactly opposite of faith is because the goal is exactly opposite of faith. We don't want to be fooled into believing something that is not true. Religion does. Religion wants to be fooled, wants to make up whatever they want to believe and just believe that because they want to.
Yeah. In a conversation I had a couple of weeks ago about it very much was philosophical, and we talked a little bit.
There goes the dog.
Gorgeous dog there. Basically, the faith could have been handy in our evolution at some point. The rustling in the tree analogy of the first hominids, and we are the descendants of those who incorrectly believed that the rustling of the tree might have been a monster or a beast, and they've sort of managed to live another day, even though they were under a wrong assumption, and that got built in a way that faith have sort of kept us alive for quite some time. Could that be the remnants of that sort of gene that persisted?
It's one of the reasons that we have supernatural beliefs is because it's shut up. It's safer to believe that the grass is moving because there's a tiger in it than to assume that it's just the wind. Because if it is just the wind, then you're fine. But on the odd chance that it's a tiger, you're dead. And so we have a tendency to fear shadows and fear dreams. And we think that dreams are the supernatural world talking to us. And every logical fallacy, if you get on Google and look up logical fallacies, you realize that every logical fallacy has been used as an argument for God. And every argument for God is a logical fallacy at the same time.
No, I completely agree with that. So with the intelligent design, obviously they're kind of there's a huge movement in Australia at the moment as well, trying to to push for that sort of thing. You've got what about the Kiwi dude, Ray Comfort, the banana dude?
Okay, Ray Comfort knows that he's lying.
You're right.
But it doesn't matter because he doesn't have to have a degree. He doesn't have to have any expertise. He doesn't have to be good at anything. He doesn't have to know anything. And he makes $4 million a year and has a 2-story house on the beach in Malibu, California. Shut up. You'll never get a Great Pyrenees. They bark constantly.
Oh, it's incredible. I mean, Ray Comfort talks about, I don't know if it's a sarcasm video or whatever, but his conversation about the banana, not realizing the banana that he's holding, it was supposed to artificially
it's genetically modified, yeah, and did not exist 1,000 years ago. It just didn't. And interestingly, there was another banana that is a sweeter version of the banana we have now is not the good one. The good banana, because you notice that bananas are seedless now, or plantains, the original version of it was just nothing but just huge unchewable seeds that occupied almost all of the meat there. We now have these great big bananas where the seeds are just reduced to these tiny little fully edible black spots, and that's it. But we have to splice these because the seeds have so malformed that it can no longer reproduce normally. There was a sweet banana that was wiped out in the 1930s, the good banana, and there was some kind of a terrible storm. I think it was just a storm, a single storm, that wiped out the entire crop, and so there was nothing left to splice from. And so we have the lower level banana is all we have now.
Yeah.
So imagine getting a banana that tastes like a ripe banana, but is not a ripe banana. So it doesn't give you that sick feeling when you're eating it. It just gives you that extra sugar rush kind of a feeling. That would be what the old banana would be like.
Right. Evolution is an interesting process. We are still in the middle of it. It's happening. One of their allegations is, well, it's not observable. We can't really see it in a lab, so it sort of breaks one of the rules of science. It's not observable. But obviously yourself and multiple educated people will actually mix the difference. And we actually can witness evolution in our lifetime.
We've had to depend on it, or the agricultural industry and livestock industry both have had to depend on that. I mean, we have a lot of crops that didn't exist hundreds of years ago. I mean, like broccoli and kale and a number of others, like 7 different types of vegetable that we've derived all from one plant, one individual original species that's been derived into all of these others. And that's not just with, some crops, that's with like all of them. I mean, what we have for watermelons, look how we have the seedless watermelons now. If you were to go back to the original, because there are some strains of the original version of watermelon that still exist, they're almost inedible. If you could imagine eating a pomegranate. That's what the original watermelon was like.
Yeah.
Where it was there was only a little bit of meat around every seed, and the rest was inedible.
Yeah.
And now look now that we have seedless watermelons that we've derived through a series of mutations and selective breeding, now we have seedless, nothing but meat watermelons. Yeah. The same with peaches. Peaches used to be these almost pill-sized things. They were the size of large grapes today. You can sometimes buy really good-sized grapes, but that's what a peach looked like hundreds of years ago, where there's a big old seed and there's some meat around it, and you'd have to spit the seed out. And now the seed is as big as the peach used to be. Now look at the size of the peach, and we've had to manipulate evolutionary processes throughout agriculture in order to survive. So it's a little ridiculous when people try to deny that on the straw man, that evolution means one kind of thing suddenly giving birth to another fundamentally different kind of thing, because evolution does not teach that, does not allow that. That is a straw man fallacy, a deliberate lie by the creationists.
Right. Aron, can you use a species or a being that has a short life cycle, like the mayfly, for example, to witness multiple generations and sort of infer some information on the back of that and see mutations and changes happen from one generation to another?
It's certainly easier to do that with animals that have a very short lifespan, like fruit flies. Drosophila is a primary example in all types of research on genetics. They always use fruit flies because they're easy to keep. You can keep a whole lot of them. You can mess them all up and nobody's going to care. And you can have generations and generations in just a few years. And so that's, for animals, it's a lot easier to do Drosophila than there has been some productive experiments using foxes, but those take decades. They're not very productive, and everybody's outraged because you have all of these lab animals, and they are effectively dogs, or they're very close to dogs, and so people have a lot of sympathy for those. It's a lot easier to work with fruit flies when you're doing evolutionary research.
Yeah. This is quite interesting. With the processes, I mean, Richard Dawkins talked about the eye and the evolution of the eye, and I quite like the analogy of how can you start with a quarter of a wing to half a wing and then a full wing, a slit that can only detect light and goes towards light, to something that with 25% of vision that can just make out pictures, and then you get to the eye. Do you think something like the human eye, which is not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, it's actually got lots of issues with the how it's built and how things are inside out and the blind spots and so forth, but do you think something like that, because they use that quite often to say this is perfection and there's no way something like this could have just evolved in a short lifespan?
Darwin said, "To suppose that the eye, with all of its inimitable contrivances for adjusting the focus to different distances, for admitting different amounts of light, for the correction of spherical chromatic aberration, could have been formed by natural selection, seems, I freely admit, absurd in the highest degree." But then he goes on after that, and that's the only part that they quote. But then he goes on after that and spends 4 pages of his book talking about what reason tells me, where he's explaining all the evidence for how the eye evidently did evolve, and not just once. It evolved independently a number of different times because there are different lineages. You don't find the human eye in anything that isn't a mammal. We have mammal eyes, so we are mammals. We have mammal eyes. Birds have bird eyes, not mammal eyes. Octopods, the octopus and squid, they have very advanced eyes. But they're for cephalopods. They don't have mammal eyes. Their eyes are actually better than ours because of the way the retina is designed, incidentally, not deliberately. But the eye has evolved under a number of different platforms. The cephalopod eye is similar to ours in construct, but better designed than the mammal eye is. And then there are a number of other organisms that had completely different kinds of compound eyes. We have insects that have a different kind of compound eye than decapods or chelicerates. They all have different kinds of eyes, and they all stem from individual origins. And it's all because you have light-sensitive cells that don't have every ability, but the simplest thing is an advantage over not having that thing at all. So if you can tell light and dark, and that's all you can tell, well, at least you can tell that. And if you can tell directions of things, well, that's brilliant. That's why. Did you know that jellyfish have eyes?
They're like
Jellyfish actually have several eyes, a whole lot of them. They're very simple.
Mm-hmm.
And they usually only tell light from dark, but this enables the jellyfish to respond so that it doesn't, how they move by this pulsation. It's not really an intentional thing, but they can change direction. And so the jellyfish wants to be within a certain range from the surface. And they use this array of eyes around their bell to indicate how deep they are. Any modification of that eye is an improvement over the last one and gives it a better ability. So that's where it goes.
Yeah.
And ultimately you end up with a half a dozen completely different, fundamentally different types of eyes. And the reason that cephalopods don't have mammal eyes and mammals don't have cephalopods eyes, or the reason there are no mammals with compound eyes and so forth, is obviously evolution. That's the only explanation. And there is no even attempt at explanation from the creationists. They don't care. They just want to pretend that they're so special that they're the reason the universe exists. And anybody who doesn't believe that they're so special, they're the reason the universe exists, is declared to be arrogant. Shut up.
Aron, with your conversation with Hovind, there was basic misinformation, misunderstanding of simple biology, like the difference between classes, genus, clade, and kind. Obviously, the word kind.
Yeah, he's not just dishonest. I mean, he's very obviously really dishonest. He's been telling the same lies that he knows are lies. He's been telling them for years, and he's never going to admit a mistake because he's an incredible narcissist. He can't admit a mistake. But at the same time, he's also fantastically stupid, which makes him really, really a lot of fun to argue with. If you're the kind who really enjoys banging your head into a wall until you're bloody in the forehead, he's the guy to argue with.
Yeah, he insisted.
Really inane.
He insisted throughout the conversation that we came from rocks, and
and nobody believes that. I mean, he believes that actually. He believes that he was made from mud.
But
evolution, there's not a single textbook that teaches that. He is lying. And he said that he tried to come up with some excuse to justify. He says, well, the earliest organisms were made of minerals. No, they're not. There are no minerals in the earliest organisms. So he's wrong even about that. He's wrong about everything, but he doesn't care. He just wants to seem that he's right so that the 7 or 8 minions that provide his slave labor for the retirement home that he's having built for him for free don't know any better.
And like he kept talking about oxygen being emitted from rocks, and this is how oxygen came about, and he kept correcting him. So like, this is basic stuff, primary school stuff almost. But obviously he's got his following, and he's very, very confident. Like when he talks, as if it's almost like this is a worldwide known knowledge. How can you not know that sort of thing?
Isn't it sad that there are people who are motivated by confidence rather than accuracy? So somebody can come just be completely bombastic in all of the bullshit they say, absolutely wrong about everything, but everybody loves them because they're so confident. And it doesn't matter that they're wrong.
Well, someone comes to mind. I think your president is very similar to that sort of thing.
You've noticed.
Kind of noticed, yeah. I think we've just finished an hour now, a few minutes. Would you like, Aron, if we can take some few questions from the audience?
I can take a very few. I am going to have to go very soon, so I can take a very few questions.
Sure. We'll take maybe 3 or 4, and we'll leave it at that.
That'll do.
Fantastic. All right, guys, if you can start sending your questions in, that'll be great. And while this is happening, Aron, I'm just gonna, I know you've been conversing with few Muslims of late and dissecting the Quran, which is quite interesting. So I will be telling my audience here as well about your episodes, and I'll put a link to your channel so they can start having a look at your conversation regarding the Quran. But one thing about Islam that is slightly different. They don't say they don't have a problem with evolution. They can actually be compatible with evolution because the Quran doesn't say anything really to that regard. So they say, well, we can accept it as it is really, and we can just say, hey, this is God's way of creating.
Yeah, I've noticed. I mean, that's a weird thing that Muslims have that option, that they don't have to deny the science the way Christians do. Yet I've encountered a number of Muslims who insist on doing that, even though they don't have to. And I don't know why they do. I mean, why would you give yourself the extra burden of having to be a science denialist when it's not even required of your scripture?
My personal theory, Aron, is that for some reason they think the evolution theory of evolution and the scientific community that backs it up is atheistic in nature, and they're trying to push a materialistic agenda, and they're opposing that regardless of the contents. It's just they reckon it's a worldwide conspiracy. The materialistic atheists want to take over the world, and this is how they're combating it.
Yeah, okay, so when you say materialistic atheists, I translate that as the people who understand reality versus the people who want to believe and make believe.
Yeah, I completely agree. Okay, so we've got a first question here. How Aron Ra look at the effect of the artificial intelligence and machine learning on evolution?
Look at the effect of what on intelligence?
The effect of artificial intelligence and machine learning on evolution.
Okay. Well, we don't have that on evolution yet. At least not on biological evolution. And that's one of the things that, there's a number of people who deal with automation and computer automation, people like Elon Musk and Bill Gates, who are very concerned about artificial intelligence. Because once a machine begins to learn, it can learn exponentially, which means it's going to be smarter than us very, very quickly.
Right, but do you think you need biology still for evolution to take place? Do you think a completely mechanical parts can self-evolve or can be subject to mutations and random mutation and natural selections, or will evolve different type of evolution?
Well, I think we're talking about something different now. If we were talking about artificial intelligence, then you don't need random mutations and natural selection. You programmed in an algorithm that the thing can learn, and so once that's written well enough that it can perform the function intended, that's going to learn faster than we can and know more than we can in a very short period of time, and that's what makes it scary. But it's not biological.
Is it possible that human intervention leads to creating completely new species or restore extinct ones someday?
Restoring extinct ones is difficult because DNA doesn't last very long. You can find traces of it. And like when we find Neanderthal DNA inside of Homo sapiens DNA, at most, we can find 4% of their genome in ours. And so we don't have enough of their genome to make a Neanderthal. And when we find, as has sometimes happened, we'll find like a frozen mammoth, and we can get the complete genetic code from their stomach lining and hope that we haven't lost anything important, because there's degradation even in 10,000 years old. There's going to be degradation in the DNA. So while you could implant that into, let's say, an Indian elephant, which is the closest living relative to the woolly mammoth, you would produce something that looks like a mammoth if you could activate that DNA, because I've had some trouble with that. It's like 7 different companies have tried and failed. But if they could activate that DNA and have it be functional, and I think we have the technology to do that, you're still going to be missing huge chunks. I mean, if you get 7% of a mammoth's DNA, you might, and you put that in an Indian elephant, the Indian elephant will likely, the Indian elephant's DNA will likely fill in all of those gaps of degradation. And you could produce an actual perfect mammoth, but you wouldn't really know if it's a perfect mammoth or not, because we might have missed something important in some other part of the genome that isn't there anymore.
Very true.
And the part of the genome that we have, I mean, if you take it out of a mammoth and you compare it with an Indian elephant, chances are that most of it or all of it is going to perfectly match with the Indian elephant.
Right. Aron, in respect of your time, we're taking a couple more, and that's it.
Okay.
One question from Laith says, what makes America still theist country comparing to Europe?
one of the things that I understand was that there was early on, I want to say about 1831, there was a rebellion against the fact that the founding fathers were such secularists. I mean, they were the closest thing you could be in the 1700s to being atheist. All of them were heavily educated, and most of them were extremely secular. The few people that identified as Christians, most of them declared themselves to be Unitarian Christians, which means that they didn't even believe that Jesus was the Son of God. So they were very nearly atheist. And the lower class people, the people that didn't have the advantage of wealth and education and leisure, were much more prone to religious beliefs, having no idea what science is. So they had a whole bunch of religious revivals, waves of religious revivals. And this was directly, initially, in rebellion against the atheistic founding fathers. And the fact that our Constitution was the very first secular Constitution ever was seen as a blight to religious people who tried to deny forever that it was ever secular. And that's how we get into the sad position we are in today, where Donald Trump names a young Earth creationists to effectively destroy our Constitution from the Supreme Court.
Thank you. Aron, a final question for you. Is there any factor except genetic mutations and the environment in which species live in that affect evolution? Do you think these are the only two factors that can affect evolution, or there could be multiple other factors?
There's endosymbiosis and epigenetics, and then there's different aspects of the genetic thing that you were just mentioning. It's not just natural selection, it's also sexual selection, and with the core of all of it is genetic drift. And so there's a lot of subtleties and variants. We haven't even discovered all the mechanisms yet. Darwin came up with 2 of them, and in the many decades since, we've come up with a handful more, and we know that there is still more yet to be discovered. Fantastic.
Aron, I really enjoyed the conversation so much, and hopefully we can have another conversation at some time in the future. But as a final word, do you have any words of advice of those who are trying to pursue reality and truth?
Well, depending on what country you're in, that may not be legally possible. Now, if you can get to a country where it is legally possible, I would encourage you to do so.
Yeah.
And I would, for the moment at least, it doesn't seem like the United States is that country anymore. We're hoping to fix that, but if Trump has his way, we'll be the next Saudi Arabia.
Wow. I think the whole world will be watching with complete interest. We want to find out what's going to happen. But look, I thank you so much for your generous time today, and I was so grateful for the conversation. Went really well, and I loved every minute of it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Bye-bye.
Thank you.